What happens when a concept is, well, as fundamental as God starts to change?
Yeah.
Or even, fade away in how a whole civilization thinks? It's a huge question, maybe a bit unsettling,
Definitely unsettling.
but it's one that's really shaped centuries of how we live, how we think, in ways we're probably still figuring out.
Mm-hmm.
So today, we're doing a really fascinating deep dive into that. We're exploring this huge journey through ideas, culture, even feelings.
And our guide for this is Skylar Fiction's book, After the Funeral, The Philosophers, the Code, and the Soul's Search for Meaning. It's quite a journey.
It really is.
Yeah, our mission really is to unpack how this idea of God didn't just have one endpoint, but went through multiple deaths, you could say.
Multiple deaths. Interesting.
Yeah, not like one big event, but more like a slow, profound transformation. We're going to trace this lineage from these really deep emotional changes way back in the medieval world, all the way up to, well, today. The digital age, the sort of algorithmic soul. The goal is to pull out the key insights for you, help you understand the kind of complex roots of modern thinking and how we look for meaning now.
Especially when maybe those traditional anchors aren't quite there anymore.
Exactly. In a world that feels a bit unmoored sometimes.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Uh-huh.
And like you said, we're starting way earlier than maybe people expect.
Much earlier.
We tend to think of medieval faith as, this solid rock, comforting, stable.
That's the picture, yeah.
But what's really startling, and this comes right out in the book from the start, is that for a lot of people back then, God wasn't actually comforting at all.
Quite the opposite sometimes.
Yeah, often.
Yeah.
He was seen as this terrifying power.
Yeah.
The book calls him a sovereign of infinite wrath, a storm cloud above the soul. Faith wasn't gentle devotion. It was surprisingly forged in fear.
Forged in fear. That's a strong phrase.
It is. And the book mentions how scripture, like Luke 12.5, was used to really drive home that divine power. Fear him who, after he is killed, has authority to cast into hell. Oof.
Yeah, that lands differently, doesn't it?
It really does, and it gets even more, well, unsettling. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas apparently argued that the suffering of the damned would actually be a source of joy for the saved.
Joy. That's hard to wrap your head around.
To appreciate God's justice more, apparently. And historians like Eamon Duffy back this up, saying late medieval religion was just full of fear of purgatory, of demons, of sudden death unshriven. It's hard to really get that level of dread from where we stand now, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And a really crucial point the book makes is that this initial shift, this first kind of death, wasn't intellectual. It wasn't philosophers debating proof.
Right, it was deeper.
It was emotional, gut level. Alec Ryrie, in his work on the emotional history of doubt, shows that long before the Enlightenment thinkers got involved, ordinary people, merchants, bakers, midwives, they were already starting to, as he puts it, feel their way out of belief.
Feel their way out. I like that phrase.
Yeah, it captures it well. He tells this incredibly powerful story of a man in the 16th century who watches his child die and just cries out, "God, if you are just, then may you burn forever."
Wow. That's not theology, that's pure pain.
Exactly. It's raw. It's a betrayal. And there are other examples, just as stark. Someone saying, "God has given the devil power over the world and left us to rot." Or another poor soul praying that Christ would choke on his cross. Just visceral disillusionment.
So you have this really deep personal doubt simmering away.
Mm-hmm.
How did the church, the establishment, react? This must have seemed incredibly dangerous to them.
Oh, it did. And their reaction was, well, pretty brutal, as the book lays out. Heresy trials, public executions.
So control through fear, basically.
Exactly. These weren't just punishments. They were meant as performances of control. Public spectacles to show everyone what happens if you step out of line.
But did it work? What was the real effect of that violence?
Well, that's the paradox the book highlights. The brutality, it seems, only deepened the doubt. The more you try to force belief through terror, the more people just shut down emotionally, disengage.
You can't force love.
Right, exactly. The source says it perfectly. Love cannot be compelled, and that fear eventually collapses under its own weight. So the terrifying God might rule from the pulpit, but in people's hearts, he was starting to die a very quiet death.
Okay, so moving on from that deep, sort of hidden emotional shift.
Yeah.
The book then talks about who these early heretics actually were. And it's surprising.
Yeah, not who you might expect.
Not scholars poring over texts or revolutionaries. They were often just ordinary people, poor people even. Their doubt wasn't coming from some big philosophical argument.
No, it was coming from life.
Right, from the harshness of their lives. For them, God just. He no longer made sense of the world they lived in. In fact, he made it worse. That's a powerful indictment.
It really is. And you see these examples popping up in court records, like an Englishman in the 1530s calling the Holy Sacrament a juggling trick.
A juggling trick.
Yeah, and saying the bread was never anything but bread. Or these really shocking blasphemies recorded in Valencia, like Christ died like a dog and his blood was no better than a hen's.
Good heavens.
Or that if God existed, he was a thief who favored the rich. You can just feel the bitterness there. Even the Inquisition records show concern about, a farmer saying, God cannot see what we do in the dark, or that prayers are just words into the wind.
Just whispers of doubt everywhere. Even a woman laughing during a sermon was cause for concern.
Apparently so. It showed a lack of proper fear, proper reverence.
What strikes me about those examples, though, isn't just the defiance, but how alone these people must have been.
Oh, incredibly isolated. That's a key point. There wasn't some, atheist support group down the street.
Right. No community for them.
None at all. To actually say these things out loud, the book calls it an act of desperate courage or despair. You were cutting yourself off from everything, not just the church, but your whole society.
It puts a different spin on the start of philosophical doubt, doesn't it?
Right.
We usually think universities, scholars.
Right, the ivory tower.
But the book points somewhere else first.
Yeah.
Somewhere much more earthy. The tavern.
Ah, yes, tavern atheism.
Yes.
This is where it gets really interesting. Before the philosophers, there was laughter.
Laughter as resistance. How did that work? Mocking priests, mocking miracles.
Well, think about the jokes mentioned. Priests with mistresses, saints being just carved wood, the Pope being God's banker.
Okay, standard cynical humor, maybe.
But some went further. Jokes about crucifying Christ again and selling tickets. Or the Virgin Mary having other lovers. This wasn't just being rude. The book argues it was dangerous theology in disguise, a way to float a challenging idea, a hypothesis wrapped in safety. Because, hey, it's just a joke, right?
Sneaking doubt in through the back door.
Exactly. And the church's reaction, cracking down so hard on blasphemy, actually revealed how worried they were. It showed their own fear.
Because if people start laughing at hell,
then they become harder to scare and harder to silence. That laughter exposed the fragility of fear-based control.
which then leads, tragically, back to the authorities' ultimate weapon.
Burning the body to silence the mind, as the chapter title puts it. Public execution.
Just horrific examples. A peasant woman, beaten, branded, exiled, just for calling saints carved puppets.
Terrible. And that story of the man burned alive because he said he saw no God in the bread.
With hundreds watching. Children watching.
It's almost unimaginable. But the key insight here is the unintended consequence.
It didn't stamp out doubt.
No. It drove it underground. It forced unbelief inward. People learned to put on a show, to lie in confession, to say the words, recite the creeds, even if they didn't believe them anymore.
So unbelief just retreated inward, where it festered.
Exactly. A quiet, hidden defiance that just kept growing beneath the surface, chipping away at the church's real authority.
Okay, so we've had this emotional erosion, this sort of folk atheism and mockery. But then comes a different kind of challenge, not from pain or laughter, but from logic.
Right. This is where we see the beginnings of God's, let's call it, second death. Not in the tavern, but in the scholar's study.
And the key figure here is Spinoza.
Baruch Spinoza,
Yeah.
the quiet Jew from Amsterdam, as he's often called. And his weapon wasn't anger or jokes, it was pure, rigorous logic.
His big idea from his work ethics. Whatever is in God, and nothing can be apart from God. Now, that sounds almost religious.
It does, but it's radically different. It's not atheism in the modern sense of no God. Instead, he completely reimagined God, not as a person, a king, someone intervening.
Not the God of judgment and miracles we saw earlier.
Exactly. Spinoza's God is nature, the totality of existence governed by unbreakable laws. A God of, as the book puts it, geometry. No will, no anger, no miracles in the traditional sense.
A God of geometry.
Yeah.
Wow. And the implication there is huge, right? If God is the system, the laws.
Then why fear judgment? Why obey commandments? The whole foundation of fear-based obedience just dissolves. Spinoza was also very critical of religious authorities, arguing they often used fear to subjugate people, not enlighten them.
Unsurprisingly, this didn't go over well.
Not at all. He was famously excommunicated from his own Jewish community in Amsterdam when he was only 23.
23.
Yeah. And Christians saw his ideas as dangerous too. Leibniz, a major philosopher himself, called Spinoza's work horrible and monstrous.
Yet Spinoza himself seemed quite calm about it all.
That's what's striking. He wasn't raging against God. He was, in effect, redefining him out of existence. He offered unbelief not as anger, but as clarity. For him, salvation wasn't about the afterlife.
What was it then?
The peace that comes from understanding the rational order of the universe and your place within it. It shifts everything inward.
So redefining God was one thing, but you mentioned he also banished the God of miracles. That feels like a direct hit on traditional faith.
It was a massive shift. Remember, in medieval times, miracles were everything. They were seen as proof that God cared, that he was directly involved.
Signs of his intimacy with the world.
Precisely. But Spinoza argued, very logically, nothing happens in nature that is contrary to its universal laws. Miracles are only called such because of the ignorance of natural causes.
So miracles aren't God breaking the rules, they're just things we don't understand yet.
Exactly. God is the rules. He doesn't break them. And this idea, landing right alongside the huge scientific discoveries by people like Newton and Galileo, well, it made the traditional intervening God seem less necessary, maybe even redundant.
The distant watchmaker idea starts to creep in.
Right. God sets it up, winds the clock, and then lets it run according to its own laws. And emotionally, that's a big deal, too. You lose the comfort of miracles, that sense of direct intervention.
And you gain.
A cold precision, the book calls it. Something beautiful but indifferent. Nature's laws are majestic, but they don't care about you personally.
Okay, so if God isn't giving commandments, and miracles aren't proof of his favor, what happens to right and wrong? Human ethics takes over.
That's the next logical step in Spinoza's system. Ethics don't come from divine decree anymore. They flow from understanding the rational universe. Virtue isn't obedience. It's being in alignment with that rational nature.
Then sin.
Sin becomes ignorance, not understanding the true nature of things, acting against reason. It's not rebellion against God. It's just not getting it.
He had that famous quote, right, about a free man.
Yes. A free man thinks of nothing less than of death, and his wisdom is a meditation not on death but on life. Focus on understanding this life rationally.
You can really see how this lays the groundwork for secular thinking, for modern democracy even.
Absolutely. Moving away from religious coercion towards civic virtue, aiming to, as Spinoza put it, free each person from fear that he may live in all possible security. It's about creating a rational, safe society here and now.
But you can also feel the anxiety creeping in, can't you? That question you raised earlier. If goodness isn't backed by God's justice anymore, what stops everything from just falling apart? What provides meaning?
Exactly. That question really starts to loom large. It creates this vacuum, this space that later thinkers will wrestle with intensely.
Which brings us, inevitably, to Nietzsche.
Nietzsche. If Spinoza performed a careful autopsy, Nietzsche, as the book suggests, basically brought the hammer down.
His famous declaration in 1882. Hard to forget.
God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. Unequivocal. But the crucial thing to understand, and the book emphasizes this, is that for Nietzsche, this wasn't a triumphant shout.
Not a celebration.
No, not at all. It was more like a funeral oration, a spiritual autopsy. He saw it as diagnosing a civilizational trauma.
He used that powerful image of the madman, right?
Yes, the madman in the gay science, running into the marketplace with a lantern in the morning, shouting, "Where's God? We have killed him, you and I." And then the terrifying questions, what did we do when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now?
You really feel the disorientation, the panic almost.
For Nietzsche, it was profound existential grief because everything, Western morality, law, our whole sense of identity had been built on that foundation of God, and now it was gone, unmoored.
And he was scathing about Christianity, wasn't he? Calling it slave morality.
Fiercely critical. He argued it elevated weakness, humility, pity, obedience into virtues, holding back the strong, the creative, the life-affirming spirits. He believed that with God dead, humans finally had to stop hiding.
Stop hiding behind divine justice.
Exactly. They couldn't rely on God for meaning or morality anymore. They would have to create meaning themselves or perish. That was the stark choice.
Which leads to his idea of the Übermensch, the overman.
Right. And it's important to clarify, this wasn't about becoming some kind of dictator. It was about becoming a creator of values.
Yeah.
Someone strong enough to face the abyss, affirm life in all its harshness and beauty without illusions, and even dance atop the abyss with joy.
It sounds incredibly demanding.
Immensely. And Nietzsche wasn't entirely optimistic about humanity rising to the challenge. He predicted in The Will to Power that the coming centuries would see a rise of nihilism, meaninglessness. He called the 20th century potentially the most terrible, most questionable, and perhaps also the most hopeful of all. chillingly prescient in some ways.
So for Nietzsche, the death of God wasn't an end point, it was a starting point, a terrifying, demanding one. It required a new soul, one willing to live without heaven, to suffer without promise, to love without eternal reward.
Yeah.
That's a heavy burden.
A profound challenge indeed.
So what did come after the funeral, after Nietzsche laid it out so starkly? The book suggests the immediate reaction wasn't some explosion of Übermensch creativity,
Right.
but something quieter.
Often, yeah. A kind of silence, or maybe a dazed grappling with the implications. Thinkers like Albert Camus, Jean-Paul Sartre, they weren't really arguing if God was dead anymore. They were confronting the divine absence. The question became, okay, he's gone, what now?
Camus in his concept of the absurd.
Exactly. That feeling of tension, the clash between our deep human need for meaning and purpose, and a universe that seems utterly silent, indifferent.
At any street corner, the feeling of absurdity can strike a man in the face. That line from the myth of Sisyphus really captures it.
It does, and his incredibly stark framing of the core philosophical question. There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Basically, if life is meaningless, why go on?
But he didn't advocate suicide. His answer was rebellion.
Yes, rebellion against the absurd. Embrace it. His famous image is Sisyphus, condemned to push a rock uphill forever, only for it to roll down again. Camus says we must imagine Sisyphus happy.
Happy.
By choosing to find meaning in the struggle itself. By defying the meaninglessness, by creating value through his actions, even if the universe doesn't provide it. Living as if life has meaning, even in the face of cosmic silence.
That's a powerful stance. And Sartre, his famous line.
Man is nothing else but what he makes of himself. Radical freedom, we're condemned to be free, which sounds liberating, and it is, in a way. But it also means profound responsibility and maybe profound loneliness. No excuses, no divine plan. It's all on us.
So the spiritual death really morphs into a psychological condition almost.
You could say that. The absence becomes a weight, a space we have to fill ourselves. Although it's interesting, the source does note that even within this apparent void, that spiritual hunger didn't completely vanish.
Oh.
Yeah, it points to theologians like Paul Tillich, who talked about a God above God, not the personal deity, but the ground of being, a fundamental depth or dimension to reality that maybe persists even when the old concepts die.
So the idea of God itself starts to evolve, even for non-believers.
Potentially, yeah. A search for depth, for something more, even if it's not framed in traditional religious terms.
Which leads us neatly into the modern era. Because that hunger, that search, it didn't just disappear. The book makes this really pointed statement. God may be dead, but the hunger for him sells well.
Oof. Yeah. That hits home.
So how has that vacuum been filled? What are these modern resurrection attempts the book talks about?
Well, it describes several key areas, almost like a market of meaning. First, you've got the New Age movement, mysticism, but kind of commodified. God becomes a vibe, something customizable, spirituality as lifestyle.
Longing dressed as lifestyle. I like that.
Yeah. Then there's psychology. It really stepped into the role theology used to play for many. Therapy as secular confession.
The therapist replaces the priest.
In a way, healing replaces holiness. Think about someone like Carl Jung bringing back myth and archetypes, but framing God as part of the journey to self-realization, individuation. Salvation becomes inner peace. The enemy isn't sin, it's trauma.
That resonates a lot today.
Hugely. And maybe the biggest player in this market, capitalism itself.
How so?
Brands started selling not just products, but identity. Meaning, products become like sacraments, logos, or the new liturgical symbols. Advertising isn't just showing you a car, it's selling you freedom, status, belonging. The church of the market, the book calls it.
And what does this church demand?
Attention and credit. And it offers its own beatitudes. Blessed are the productive, the beautiful, the curated online persona.
Wow. Okay, that brings us right up to the present moment. Chapter 11. Digital divinity and the algorithmic soul. We've literally built new gods out of code.
It certainly looks that way sometimes. The book argues that faith, or at least the impulse behind it, has migrated from the altar to the interface. Think about it. Algorithms track our deepest desires, our fears, our prayers. What are we searching for online? Love, connection, answers about death, loneliness.
Our confessions become data points.
Exactly. Our desires are monetized. And it goes beyond just tracking. There's a kind of reverence for the system itself, technotheism, trusting the algorithm, submitting to its logic.
Social media as sacrament. Influencers as priests.
Priests and performance, yeah. Salvation in this world is Relevance? Being seen, being liked, going viral, and the ultimate damnation, being forgotten, becoming irrelevant, shadow banned.
And now we're even talking about AI theologians, the singularity.
Right, this idea of uploading consciousness, achieving a kind of immortality through technology. It's the old promise of resurrection, but repackaged for the digital age. No God required.
But there's a deep irony here, isn't there? The book points it out sharply.
The huge irony, we have these new gods that answer instantly, that know us intimately or seem to.
But we are lonelier than ever.
Precisely, because algorithms, data, interfaces, they cannot offer meaning. They cannot answer silence. They cannot hold suffering. They can connect us, track us, sell to us, but they can't provide that deeper sense of presence or purpose.
So, reflecting on this whole journey, it wasn't one clean break, was it?
Not at all. The book frames it perfectly as an erosion, a long, slow dusk, not a sudden blackout. We're living in the echo of those deaths, in a world still haunted by their absence, even as we invent new ways to search.
Foucault's quote comes to mind, the one the book uses. Perhaps one day, this century will be called the century of forgetting God.
But the counter-argument is, have we really forgotten, or have we just changed his name?
Pixelated his face.
Embedded him into policies, into pills, into playlists, made him smaller, maybe more manageable, less terrifying, but perhaps also less transcendent.
Still, the book includes the ache remains. That deep hunger, maybe not for certainty anymore.
But for presence, for meaning, for connection that goes deeper than the algorithm.
Which brings us back to that core question, the title almost. What comes after the funeral? Where do we go from here?
That really is the question hanging over us, isn't it?
Maybe the old concepts, the God of infinite wrath, the God of miracles. Maybe that God is well and truly dead, as Nietzsche proclaimed. But perhaps God is mystery, as that pull towards something bigger, towards love, towards unity.
Yeah.
Maybe that's spoken as last word.
A powerful thought to leave with.
Yeah. Something for all of you listening to think about. How do these different deaths of God still echo in your own life? Where do you see that search for meaning playing out, maybe in places you wouldn't expect?